So a few years ago, somebody gave me this t-shirt as a gift. And I don't think you can see it right now. I don't think it's in frame, but I'm just going to stand up for a second so that you can. It says, "The book was better." And I love this shirt because it so expresses what I usually feel when I watch a movie that's based on a book. And what I think a lot of people who enjoy books usually end up feeling about adaptations. Even if the movie is good, usually the book was better. So let's talk about why that is and what makes a good adaptation. First of all, I think that one reason why people who like books often prefer the book over the movie is just because it's their preferred format. If you're someone who enjoys reading, then the book is probably the way that you encountered the story first. Or even if it's not, it might be the way that resonates the most with you. That's just a matter of personal preference, really. Not everybody enjoys reading for pleasure, but if you do, you're probably going to enjoy what you read more than you enjoy the adaptation of it. The other thing that I think often makes the book better in a lot of people's eyes, at least people who read and enjoyed the book, is that movies often have to simplify and scale back from the book. Books overall tend to be longer, tend to be more complex. That's not always the case. I can think of examples of very simple books, particularly like novellas or children's books, where the movie actually expands upon them. Like, for instance, if you've seen the live-action How the Grinch Stole Christmas, it makes it a much more complex story than the original children's book. But that's an extreme example. For the most part, you have books that might be, 300, 500, 800, however many pages, and they have to cut it back to maybe a 2-hour movie. So characters and subplots and maybe even important themes or ideas get cut from the story, and it becomes more streamlined and things change along the way. Sometimes things change even when they don't need to, just because the screenwriter or the producer or the director or whoever thought that it was a good idea. And then, of course, there are issues with the casting choices and the actors' interpretations of the characters and the set design and all of the things that go into making a movie what it is. So even if the story is very similar, it may not look and feel the way that you expected it to when you read the book. When we read, we're all coming up with our own ideas about what's written on the page and how to visualize it and how to interpret it, and in a movie, a lot of those decisions are made for you. Another thing that I think can often make a book much better than the movie is, particularly if it was written in a first person or a close third person kind of perspective, you have the thoughts and the internal narrative of the protagonist. Whereas in a movie, you really don't. You get what's said through dialogue and what's shown through facial expressions, but sometimes that's not quite enough. For instance, I'm really not a fan of the Hunger Games movies, and I don't think that they did the books justice, particularly the first one. I know that's an unpopular opinion, but hear me out. One thing that I was really missing was Katniss's internal monologue. She knows that she is being filmed, and she knows that people from all around Panem are watching her, including her family and including people in the capital who might be willing to sponsor her and therefore increase her chances of survival. So what she is allowing the cameras and the audience to see is often very different from what's going on in her head. She censors a lot of things that she tells the reader through her internal monologue, but that she doesn't reveal to the audience. So to me, having the internal monologue gone and having only facial expressions and dialogue to rely on really makes the story very different, to the point where I felt like there was something very important that was missing. I think that the lack of internal monologue can often be a problem in movies based on a book, but especially in a case like that, where the internal monologue is so crucial and so different from what's happening on the surface. With all of that out of the way, though, while the book is usually better, there definitely are good adaptations and bad adaptations. I talk a lot about the novels of Jane Austen on this channel and different adaptations of them as well. If you're at all interested in that, you've probably heard by now about the recent Netflix adaptation of Persuasion, which is not a good movie and an even worse adaptation. You might also be familiar with the 1995 BBC miniseries adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which is generally very well liked among Jane Austen fans, even though it also makes some changes, although much less significant ones, to the original story. Most adaptations of books fall somewhere on a spectrum between the two extremes of practically perfect and totally terrible. They might make some changes. Those might be seen as negatives, but then some people might disagree and think they're improvements. There may be places in which it does the book justice and places in which it really doesn't. So let's talk about what makes an adaptation a good one. I've got 4 things here that I want to talk about that I think make a good adaptation. Number 1, as you might have guessed, is that it changes as little as possible. Now, I can't think of any adaptations that don't change anything, but the ones that change less are generally more well received by fans than the ones that make bigger changes. There will always be some aspects of an adaptation that don't quite align with the original or with particular reader interpretations of the original, and it can be difficult to balance between making a good movie and making a good adaptation. But generally, really big changes, particularly changes that affect the ending, the themes of the story, the characterization of the main characters, or really big moments that were important in the book and that were memorable in the book, tend to be not so great, whereas smaller changes might be fine or even not really noticeable. It's totally normal, for instance, for movie adaptations to streamline things into a montage or combine several scenes together to cut minor characters who don't have a super important role and things like that. But it's more of a problem, I think, if the changes affect the big picture story or have implications for potential sequels. Number 2 is respecting and valuing the original work. So this is something that I have noticed. Sometimes there are adaptations that are clearly basically a love letter to the original. Even if some changes are made, they're really respectful of the original work. They keep as much of it intact as possible, and anything that is changed enhances the story in some way or just makes it work better in the new format that's been chosen, for example, a movie. Other times, I watch an adaptation of something and I think, you really didn't understand what the original story was about. Did you even like it that much? Did you think it was any good? Why did you choose to adapt this? This is, I think, one of the big differences between the recent adaptation of Persuasion and other previous adaptations of Jane Austen's work. I really got the feeling when I was watching it that the people involved in making it did not appreciate Persuasion as a story. They had chosen it maybe for the aesthetics of the Regency era and the name recognition of it being by Jane Austen, but they really didn't seem to appreciate the protagonist's personality or just the overall tone and style of the novel. All of that was changed so drastically that it felt kind of like a slap in the face to myself as a fan of the original, and I think to a lot of people who enjoyed the original, because not only did it change things, it changed them in a way to where it was no longer the same story. As someone who reads a lot of books and who enjoys watching movie and TV series adaptations of those books, I like to feel like the people involved wanted to tell the story that they were adapting. When it feels like it wasn't respectful of the original and what it was supposed to be about, that's a problem for me. So, number 1, make as few changes as possible. Number 2, be respectful of the original. And then number 3 is to make only changes that make sense and expand or improve the story in some way. Whether that means improving it as in making it more suitable to the new format, streamlining a few things to make it fit into a shorter length of time, changes needed to adapt from a written format into a visual one, or to accommodate the fact that the main character's inner thoughts are no longer accessible to the audience. Like, for instance, the movie version of the novel Coraline does this really well. In the novel, the narrator can tell the reader exactly what Coraline is thinking and feeling, whereas in the movie, obviously that's not the case. So instead, the movie has her make friends with a little boy around her age, who she can then talk to and bounce ideas off of and share her thoughts and feelings with. Even though that is a change from the novel, it's a change that, in my opinion, works very effectively at translating it into a different format without losing an important element of the story. Another thing that I think can make adaptations very strong is when they expand upon an idea that was hinted at but not explored in the original text. Obviously, this goes more for expanding a novella or a short children's book into a movie, or expanding a novel into a TV series, not so much for streamlining a novel into a relatively short movie. But sometimes if the novel is in first person or third person limited, the movie can show scenes that took place outside of the protagonist's point of view that the reader wasn't able to see. Sometimes they can add flashbacks that show bits of the backstory that were only explained in dialogue or narration in the book, or broaden the scope of the story a little bit. An example that I think did this really well was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie from the early 2000s. The novel is relatively short even for a children's book, but the movie expands significantly on a couple of things. First of all, it actually starts with the children hiding in a bomb shelter and then being evacuated from London, rather than just kind of telling that that's what happened and starting off with their arrival at Professor Kirk's house. It includes a conversation between Edmund and Mr. Tumnus in the White Witch's dungeon, which wasn't in the book but seemed perfectly natural and like something that made sense there. And then finally, while the battle scene at the end took place off-screen, or I guess off-page rather, in the book, it actually takes place on screen in the movie, and more of the battle is shown, rather than just following Susan and Lucy and showing up at the end to see Aslan defeat the White Witch. So even though those are changes from the book, I felt like they were changes that improved the story by adding to it, rather than taking things away or changing things unnecessarily. And then the fourth thing that I think makes a good adaptation is that it can stand on its own. An adaptation should be enjoyable to people who have read the original work, but you shouldn't have to have read the original work in order to make sense of what's going on. Now, I mean, it's one thing if there are like little Easter eggs for people who have read the book or who have read other works by the same author or whatever that people who haven't might not pick up on, but when it comes to like the main plot, any kind of plot points or plot twists, anything like that, it should absolutely be that you don't have to read the book in order to understand what's going on. One very successful movie series that I feel like didn't do this all that well was the Harry Potter movies. Now, in general, I think they were pretty decent as adaptations, but I will say that I've watched them with my mother who hasn't read the books, and I often end up having to explain things to her. And there are things where if I hadn't read the books, I don't think I would understand either. Things like, for instance, where did Harry get that piece of mirror that he was carrying around in Deathly Hallows that he used when he was at Malfoy Manor and Dobby came to help? What was that thing? Where did it come from? Well, if you've read the books, you know that it was a present from Sirius and that it's a two-way mirror that allows people to communicate, kind of like a magical Zoom call. But in the Order of the Phoenix movie, the scene where Sirius would have given Harry that mirror was just completely left out. So it's not really explained properly what the piece of mirror was or where it came from. On a similar note, in the movies, both Barty Crouch Jr. and Bellatrix Lestrange are accused at various points of the attack on Neville's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom. Unlike in the books, it's not clear that they both were guilty of it and were working together. It comes across as two contradictory stories when the incident is just described in completely different ways from one movie to the next. I understand that both the fourth and fifth books were rather long and needed to be cut down, but it seems like it would be worth, another 30 seconds of explanation to avoid that kind of confusion. So those are my 4 benchmarks for what makes a good adaptation. It changes as little as possible. It's respectful of the original. The changes improve the story, expand on it, or help it to work better in a new medium rather than detracting from the story. And it can be understood on its own and seems internally consistent even if you don't know the parts that were left out. That leaves us with the question, is a good or bad adaptation the same thing as a good or bad movie? Can there be a good movie that's a bad adaptation? Or a bad movie that's a good adaptation? I think so, definitely. I will say I have not come across a lot of really precisely accurate adaptations that are utter crap as movies. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that very precisely accurate adaptations are not all that common. But I definitely have encountered movies that I enjoyed for their own sake, even though they were not really that great as an adaptation of a book. Or maybe not even a book, but another kind of story. Because I'm definitely going to point out Disney movies here. Most Disney movies are an adaptation of something, and usually they're not all that faithful to the original. In some cases, it would be very hard to, because a lot of them are based on fairy tales, which are told in various ways through different time periods and cultures. I certainly wouldn't expect a 20th century kids movie to retell accurately the version of Cinderella where the stepsisters cut up their own feet and have their eyes pecked out by birds. That doesn't mean that the Disney Cinderella is bad. It just means it's not an accurate adaptation of the version by the Grimm brothers. In general, I would say that changes are usually necessary to some degree when a book is adapted as a movie or a TV series. But too many changes, or the wrong kind of changes, the ones that impact the story in a big way, may detract from the viewing experience, both for those who enjoyed the book and those who haven't read it. Entirely faithful adaptations are rare, if not completely non-existent, but really good ones will be respectful of the original work and make changes as needed in order to make it work well in a more audiovisual format. What are your favorite adaptations of books that you've read? Is there anything you look for as far as what makes a good adaptation that wasn't on my list? Feel free to leave a comment down below, and if you liked this, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.